thanks to everybody for coming. I was just thinking when we were listening to the previous speakers who have all spoken so eloquently about these different aspects of the war in Ukraine, what an amazing thing it is that really you have to come to meetings like this to hear these kind of arguments, that you don't hear this on any of the media, you don't get it in the newspapers, you don't get it on television. And indeed, when you try to put these arguments, as we know has been the case with us since the beginning of this year, you are pilloried as people who somehow are supporters of Putin. You know, we're told it's about NATO expansion. That's just what Putin says, as if that negates the argument, you know, even though it's possible for him to regard NATO expansion as a problem, and for us to regard it as a problem, albeit for very different reasons. And I just think that one of the things that we are facing now is a clampdown on discussion about war and about these general issues, which I don't think I've ever seen before. I mean, when I try and think back to when it was like this, possibly during the Falklands or the Malvinas in 1982, but of course that was a war with much less global significance and much less major forces involved. But I'm not sure even then that the level of kind of support for our government, the determination that everybody has to fall in behind the government, the way in which school children and all sorts of other people are being used in this way to get these ideas across, I think is really quite an astonishing thing when you look at it. And it's not obviously an easy thing for us. And perhaps it strikes you most when you think about Parliament. I mean, in Parliament we have the government, we have the opposition, and we have a whole number of minor parties. I think it's fair to say that with the exception of Sinn Féin and Jeremy Corbyn, both of whom have been quite rightly credited tonight for doing so, I don't think there is anybody in that Parliament who is openly speaking up against this war. And it seems to me, and against our government's role in it, because our government's role, as previous people have said, is absolutely central to what is going on. And we were told at the beginning of this war two things. We were told this had nothing to do with NATO expansion, and we were also told there would be no intervention from the US, from Britain, or from any of the other NATO countries. Now, both of these, I think it's fairly obvious now, simply aren't true. That if you look at what is happening, and we've condemned the invasion by Russia, we've been absolutely clear that we are against what Putin has done. Nonetheless, we've also said you cannot simply look at this as though it happened in the last few weeks. This is the product of years, not just of NATO expansion, although that's a central part of it, but the way in which arms spending has increased. The world has become much, much more militarised even than it was 20 years ago. The way in which we have conducted these wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, intervention in Syria, all of these things which have been so damaging to civil society in all those places and to our own society as well. So I think you've got to look at all these things and then look about what is happening at the moment, because Andrew referred to it very, very well in terms of the increase in arms spending and the role of arms spending and arms suppliers in these wars. But it's really quite astonishing what is going on. Germany, let's just take the case of Germany. As Andrew said, doubling its defence, so-called spending, which will put it at a higher level than British defence spending. At the moment, Britain is by far the biggest in Europe. But also, a lot of that money is going to be spent on American planes, which will have the capacity to carry nuclear bombs. That is a fairly terrifying thing. It's also something where German politics and German society is being very, very much transformed around this question. I heard one of the politicians, I can't remember which one it was, who said she was very proud of the fact that her grandfather had fought in the Wehrmacht in 1945. Now, while I don't for a minute believe that everybody who was in the Wehrmacht in 1945 was a Nazi, nonetheless, this is a rewriting of history to regard this as a kind of equal battle as to what actually went on. And it tells you how far the whole consensus that they once had in Germany about the Second World War and its aftermath is now breaking down and is also becoming a much more militarised society. And I think for any of us, you're looking at that and you're seeing already there's a sizable far right in Germany. Does anybody believe they're not going to be strengthened by this kind of development? By the German army is now saying it has practically anything that it wants. It's got, it's got a wish list of anything that it can want. This is a big transformation in German politics, which is very important. But it's happening across Europe. It's happening in terms of Ireland, where, as Joe said, the long-held neutrality of Ireland is now being challenged, and that will have major consequences. We've got Finland and Sweden applying for NATO membership, and obviously will join NATO in the next few months, traditionally neutral countries. This is a huge change in terms of what is going on. You've also got, across Eastern Europe now, there are 10 times the number of troops under NATO control, what is it, 40,000 troops under NATO control in the neighbouring countries to Ukraine than there were the day before Russia invaded. So anybody who thinks this isn't going in a much more militarised direction isn't looking at the reality. You look at what the United States is putting in, $40 billion is the latest estimate of what they're spending on aid, nearly all of it military aid. So when people say this is a war that has nothing to do with NATO, it just is simply belied by the facts that we are talking about a proxy war, as previous speakers have said, and also a war which is treated with incredibly double standards. I mean, I look at the footage of what's happening in Ukraine, and it's deeply distressing. It's horrible to see people who are refugees, it's horrible to see people obviously killed or injured, but even just the sheer impact in the society of war in terms of physical health, mental health, all those other things, is very, very distressing. And there have been huge casualties on both sides. The Ukrainians are saying they're losing 100 troops a day. The Russian troop losses have put it something like 15,000. I saw a figure today which says that 1,000 Russian tanks have been destroyed. I don't know how accurate any of these particular figures are. But you're talking about terrible losses in war. And yet I do have, when George Bush, as usual, George Bush can be relied on to say something, not very intelligent. When he said we have to stop Putin with this deadly, illegal, terrible invasion of Iraq, he was actually pointing to the war crimes that he was involved in, and that Tony Blair was involved in. He was pointing to this 2 decades of war, which have been absolutely central to our politics. So I don't think we should really assume that just because in those wars the British media was embedded with the troops, and therefore we saw it from the troops' point of view, that anything different happened to the people in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else where we invaded. Exactly the same misery and death were the things that they suffered, but we don't hear about this in anything like the same way. The point that Andrew made, I think, is very, very important. Liz Truss has gone to Bosnia and Herzegovina, of all places, today, to make a speech saying there can't be any backing down, there can't be any peace talks over Ukraine, there can't be any of these things. We have to keep our foot on the accelerator, is the expression that she used. Now, keep your foot on the accelerator to have an even bigger war. That's the only thing that keeping your foot on the accelerator is going to do. Our government is encouraging this war in every single way that they can, by huge amounts of money, £2 billion again, from the British government, a huge amount of money. When you hear today, there's more money for pensioners and people to deal with the fuel prices, and the BBC, of course, the first question is, well, where's this money going to come from, and who's going to pay for it? It'll be paid by taxpayers. Where do they think the money for arming Ukraine is coming from? Boris Johnson's own pocket? I don't think so. It's coming from us. And they are going to come back this year. We already pay, 2.5% nearly in defence spending as a proportion of our GDP. They will go for 3 or even higher percent. Paul Mason, of course, who's one of the keenest warmongers in this situation, wants us to spend 5% of total national wealth in this country on arms and on military spending. Now, what does this mean for us? Because I think it's very important that we grasp the situation that we're in, that this war is a war that we proposed from the beginning, but it also has a different characteristic because it's not our government directly involved in invading another country. And therefore people see it in a different way, quite rightly, and look at it in a different way. And our message is one that is getting across, but we have to do everything we can to get that message across more and more. And we have a real problem on the left here. You know, if you look at the left, which traditionally you would expect to be supporting an anti-war movement. We know that Keir Starmer has regarded it as a point of absolute principle. You're not allowed to presumably criticise NATO past, present or future. This is, you know, now you're not allowed to be a Labour MP if you do this. But there's also, within the trade union movement, there's a lot of division over this question. So we have a huge amount of work to do, I think, on this. And I think we need to do two things. One is that we need to keep putting these arguments over what the real situation is, what the history of all this is. That none of this started a few months ago, but it goes back a very, very long time ago, including the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which we don't really have time to go into tonight. But that these things are complex questions, but actually they show the way in which our government and its allies have behaved over the last 2 decades. I also think that we need to link it to the other issues going on in this country. We have a huge cost of living crisis, which is going to make, even with these things today, is still going to make millions and millions of people in this country much worse off with the energy prices, with the food prices, with all the other costs that people have. We're also going to see a polarisation. If the RMT do take industrial action in the next few weeks, which is, well, you know, it's a fantastic vote that they got, a fantastic endorsement to take industrial action. I think we, in the anti-war movement, have to give them all our solidarity, because this is about standing up for not just about international issues, but domestic issues as well. And these two things are linked. So it's important we support the strike, which is already being attacked by the Mail and the Express and all the other papers which are so pleased that Boris Johnson doesn't have to worry about Partygate anymore. We've got the TUC demonstration on June the 18th, and we have to have that. We're going to have a block on that where we talk about, we don't want an increase in defence spending, we want welfare, not warfare, we want to do all those kind of things. And we have to really hold to account those people who say there's a complete separation between the domestic politics and what's happening internationally. There isn't. In an imperialist country like Britain, foreign policy is domestic policy, and we shouldn't pretend there's anything different about it. So I'd just like to say finally two things that people may speak about these from the floor. On the 13th of June, on a Monday, for those of you that can take the day off work, or if you're not working, come to it, we're going to be in Windsor to demonstrate against Tony Blair, who is getting the Order of the Garter. We can think of maybe another order that we can give him, but we'll be demonstrating there. So please join us if you can on that day. And on the 25th of June, which is just before the NATO summit in Madrid, we're having a day of action as part of the international day of action going on, and we're going to be in, I think, in Downing Street in the Ministry of Defence. We're not quite sure, I think, about where we're going to be, but you'll be the first to know when we've sorted it out. But we are going to be outside there protesting about everything that our government is doing to make this war worse, because there are no winners in these kind of wars. The winners are the people who make money from oil, who make money from arms, who make money from all these sorts. It is working people, conscript soldiers in Russia, ordinary working people in Ukraine who are dying as a result of this. That's why we need to have an immediate ceasefire, we need the troops out, but also we have to have some kind of peace talks. Those will not solve the major questions of imperialism that face us in the world, but they would at least be the beginning of saying we are not going to put up with this war, and we're not going to put up with it escalating into a much, much bigger war, which will mean the death and destruction of millions more people. Thanks.